I want you to imagine something with me for a moment. I got this from one of the books that I was reading as I was preparing for the Heaven series. But I want you to imagine that there has been a cataclysmic event on Earth that has wiped out all of our food supply, all the toxins that we release through our cars and all of that. Like, it's messed up the environment. Like, Earth is totally an unlivable place. Like, we're going to have to go somewhere else. And somebody comes up with the idea that Mars is like the next best place that we could go to. And so we all decide that, okay, we're going to, launch these space shuttles. We're going to get off Earth because that's not going to last very long. And we're just going to journey to Mars. And imagine you get to be one of the first people that, takes off on this whole journey. Now, you don't really know much about everything. You just know that it's Mars. You know that you've been selected. So you and your family, you pack up all your belongings, all the pictures, some of the clothes, and some of the things that you want to take on your journey. You think it's pretty far. You don't really know how far it's going to take or how long it's going to take, but you decide to get in the space shuttle. And so you're there, your family's there, you're all buckled in, the countdown starts, and then you look over to the fellow astronaut or some of the other people that are there and say, hey, do we know anything about what's about to happen? Do we know anything about this place? What's it like over in Mars? And they turned and looked at you and said, we don't really know anything either. We just were told to come here and bring everything we could, that Earth was unlivable. Imagine what you would feel like in that moment if you knew that you were going to leave Earth, you were heading to Mars, you didn't know anything about it, you didn't know what the weather was going to be like, you didn't know what kind of clothes and stuff that would happen, you didn't know what the oxygen level was going to be like, you didn't know where you were going to get food, you didn't know what the job situation, how many people were going, you knew nothing about it, but there you are taking off. It would be a weird feeling, right? Why would we know that we're going somewhere or know that we can't stay where we're at? Why would we leave Earth not knowing the next place that we're going to? And if you want to know why it's important to preach a sermon series about heaven, it's the reality that everybody spends eternity somewhere. Everybody spends eternity somewhere. And just like you would not want to leave Earth heading to a trip to Mars and not know what that next place is like, as your pastor, I don't want you to leave this earth. I don't want you to leave this life without really understanding what comes next. So I want to do a sermon series entitled Heaven, Is It Really For Real? And what I want to do is every Sunday that we're preaching through this series, I want to ask and answer certain questions that maybe you have heard about heaven, maybe thoughts you've had about heaven. I know when we think about as Christians the afterlife and what it must be like to be with God in heaven, we've got tons of questions. But maybe you're here this morning and you don't really even know if there really is a heaven. And I want to answer that question too. Is there really even a heaven? I mean, is there an afterlife? I mean, we've never really got to have a lot of conversations with people who pass from this life into the next. I mean, perhaps you've seen movies. There's a movie actually made called Heaven is for Real. There's other stuff out there. Perhaps, you read in Scripture and you were raised in Sunday school, but in your mind, you really wonder, is there really a heaven? Is there really an afterlife? How do we know that when we breathe our last here on earth that we're just going to go to some other place? And perhaps you've heard things about heaven. Perhaps you've heard songs, we sing in church, I'll fly away, and songs like that. I've got a mansion on a hilltop. I hold a clear title to it. And all these thoughts about heaven. Perhaps you've heard things about streets of gold and pearly gates, and maybe you've even heard of a New Jerusalem or a large city. What is that about? But even before we get to what is heaven like, let's just answer the question, is heaven really for real? Is there an actual heaven? Is it more than just a state of mind? Is it an actual place that certain people or all people, how do we know, is it a place where people go? Well, the first way I want to answer that question is really thinking about how God designed the world. So if you're here and maybe you're not a person of faith, you don't really even know if this stuff is really true or not. You're just kind of showing up here and you've got questions, but deep down in your heart, you really don't know. Let me just kind of start you off with this, and then some of the Christians, let's get us on the same page. Is heaven really for real? Let me ask you this question. Is this world that we're living in really for real? Have you ever thought about that? I mean, regardless of what you believe, I mean, you would at least agree that we are living in a tangible world. We have senses, we have mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, I mean, deserts, all kinds of things like rainforests. We believe that we currently live in a physical world. Now, if you are a person of faith, you believe that that world had a beginning and it wasn't just random. I understand that there may be some Big Bang theory where people think that there was some cataclysmic event that launched all the universe, but it's just really honestly hard to believe that all of that was by chance. If you walked in the street and you picked up a pocket watch and you saw the insides of it had so much design and so much, architecture just inside a little pocket watch, you would not just imagine that all of that just happened random by chance. And let me just tell you, the way the earth and the way our solar system, the way our sun and all of that works, the planets and our environments, the way it works is so amazing. I would just encourage you to study that out. I don't know how you would see everything that God has created in this world and just come to some conclusion that it had to be random and just by chance. It doesn't really happen in any other planet that we know of. I mean, we're trying to send people to Mars. We're trying to figure out other planets, but there's no planet currently that we understand it like Earth. It is a special thing. If we were too close to the sun, if we were closer to the sun, we'd disintegrate. If we were actually, further away from the sun, we would, as a planet, freeze. Earth happens to be in the precise location to sustain life that we have today. And we're moving, by the way, just in case you know that. We're actually moving miles per hour, as we're rotating around the sun, and yet we don't even feel a thing. Isn't that just incredible? But I don't think it happened by chance. But let's just say, you're trying to think, okay, is this physical world we live in? If you're a person of faith, what I really want to take you back to is really the book of Genesis, where God began this whole big thing called planet Earth and humanity. As Christians, we believe, because Jesus believed this, that there was a first man and a first woman, Adam and Eve, and God created the world. But here's the thing. He did not create the world as we experience the world today. In our world today, there are hurricanes that wipe out entire communities. There's tornadoes. There's decay. There's toxic chemicals floating around our environment. The world, as we experience it today, was not the world that God originally created. In fact, in Genesis, this is what the Bible teaches about what God created in the beginning. In the beginning, the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living creature. So as a pastor, or maybe you've heard a minister say, ashes to ashes, dust to dust at a person's funeral. Perhaps you heard that. It's just the idea that when God made Adam, he took him from the dust. He created him from this planet, from this earth. But there's nothing bad about this earth. In fact, in the next verse, this is what we see. And the Lord God planted a garden in the east, and there he put the man who he had formed. And out of the ground the Lord made to spring every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And what kind of plants? What kind of trees? An amazing, beautiful garden. Me personally, I can't get anything to grow. Maybe I can make weeds grow, but I can't make like good flowers to grow. It's just not in my DNA. But when God created the earth, and when he created man and woman, and he put them in this beautiful garden, it was just amazing. And it said this, what kind of trees? In the next verse he says, the tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So I want you to picture this, because really, when we think about heaven, I think we really need to start with heaven part one. You're like, well, what is that? What are you talking about, Jordan? It's the reality that heaven has always been on God's mind. Heaven wasn't really plan B. In fact, heaven was plan A. When I describe heaven, and when I talk about heaven, really what I'm talking about is a perfect place with no sin, pain, hurt, or decay, where we can fellowship with God and one of another. That's what God had in the beginning, in his mind. When he created the world, he did not create the world and want it to be the world that we experience today, where there's harsh weather and seasons, and things die and have to get reborn or have to get new things out in the world. That's not what God plan. God planned a perfect world from the beginning, and He planned it, and this is really key, He planned it to be as tangible as we experience it today. You can climb mountains. You can taste food. You can experience life. So maybe this will just dispel one of our biggest ideas about heaven. In many of our minds, we think, and maybe because we've been told this, or maybe because of preachers like me, I didn't preach it right, but in our minds, we think that heaven is just like one big long church service where there's maybe pews and everybody has to dress up and we just sing one hymn after the other. Well, let me just tell you, whether you have that's really not in the Bible. I mean, we're going to sing, don't get me wrong, and we're going to be with people, but it's not going to be boring. It's not going to be stuffy. It's not going to be religious. If you want to know what God had in mind when He created heaven, you need to take a good look around and imagine what this world would be like without sin and darkness. Instead of imagining a never-ending, boring church service where everybody plays harps, imagine the Garden of Eden, because heaven has always been on God's mind. Now, if you remember this scripture, or perhaps you are reading this now, maybe for the first time, and you're seeing a little something here, there's something that kind of, it's like the Jaws music, like, that lets you know that something's about to happen. And it happens in this verse. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden. The tree of life. Ooh, I don't know what that tree is, but I want to eat whatever fruit's on the tree of life. But it also says, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, if you've followed this story, or if you've heard of this story, you realize that God, when He created Adam and Eve and put them in the garden, He only gave them one stinking rule. For those of us that think that God is just a strict, drill sergeant with a bunch of rules, you just really need to go back to how God originally created it. He just created it with just one rule. And this was His rule. You can eat anything in the garden, just stay away from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In fact, this is what God told Adam and Eve. If you eat of that tree, you will surely die. Now, dying was something that Adam and Eve had no idea what that was. Adam and Eve were created to be immortal beings, right? They were never going to get thirsty. They were never going to get hungry. They were never going to get older and perish and deal with decay. And in fact, their work, this is something that maybe you haven't thought about before, but Adam actually had a job. The Bible said that when He put him in the garden, He put it in the garden to work and to keep it. Now, there were no bosses, there were no deadlines, there was no quotas. So his job was like the best. It was like getting to do something for God, and he never sweated, and it never hurt, and it was never painful, and nobody got fired or demoted or anything like that. It was an amazing, perfect place that God created. He just gave them one rule: do not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But of course, if you are familiar with this story, we ate from the wrong tree. You tell us not to do something, don't stick that fork in that electrical outlet. Wow, I didn't think about it now, but now I really want to do it. And that's what we did. We ate of the tree. Adam ate of the tree. Adam and Eve ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And just like God said, sin entered into the world, where once we had no idea what sin and death and pain and hurt ever was. Mankind didn't know what those things were. Because of our sin entered the world, and along with it, death, decay, body aches, demotions, discouragement, depression, anxiety, hospitals, sickness, cancer, the whole deal. It all comes from the sin of Adam and Eve and the sin that we continue to do in our own lives. We all want to make the world a better place, but in our most selfish states, we all kind of help things go the wrong direction if we're not careful. But God always had a plan to be with His people. He always had a plan. And that's really why we should believe in heaven. That's one of the reasons why we should believe in heaven. I mean, if God created this world, and originally this world was supposed to be perfect, why wouldn't God want to recreate this world and make it a place where we could inhabit it again without sin, without death, without pain? It's something else to think about. Now, if you're still not convinced and you're thinking to yourself, okay, Jordan, I mean, I can see what God intended maybe with this world, but I mean, to be honest with you, Jordan, this is just really tough because, there's people that claim to have visions. We don't know if that's true or not. I mean, who could argue with a person that says he's been to heaven or not? But Jordan, I mean, is it really for real? I mean, you telling me that somewhere when a person breathes their last, they enter in to this ethereal place with, golden streets and pearly gates, and is it, are people waiting at the gate and all these kind of things? One story that I heard, it's kind of a joke, I thought was pretty funny. This husband and wife ended up divorcing, and they kind of went their separate ways until the man passed away. And he went up to heaven, and St. Peter was at the pearly gates, and he said, okay, said, Peter, what do I got to do to get in? And he said, well, it's really easy. You just got to spell one word. He said, what's the word? He said, love. He said, that's all you got to do is spell the word to get in. He said, really? That's pretty incredible. L-O-V-E. He said, yep, you're good. That's all it takes. This is what this place is about. You spell that word, you get in. So he gets in, and then all of a sudden St. Peter hears something going on in the back, and he says, hey, could you take over, you know the drill. When someone comes up, just get them to spell love. If they spell it right, they get in. And says, oh, yeah, I can. You go take care of it, St. Peter, I'll take it at the top. Well, his ex-wife comes up. And he says, well, I didn't know you were. He's like, yeah, I know, I'm taking over for St. Peter. Anyway, it's real easy. All you got to do is spell one word. And she said, well, really, what is the word? He said, Czechoslovakia. He didn't want his ex-wife to get in. So we have these ideas, right? Is it like that? Is there some sort of test we've got to take? Is there some sort of final exam? I mean, how do we know? I mean, when we get up to the next life, is there like this eternal weight of scales? And God takes all the good things that we've done and he measures them against all the bad things that we've done. And as long as the good outweighs the bad, then we get in. I mean, what is it really about? Do you have to be a part of a specific denomination in Christianity? Are Pentecostals the only one to get in? Or Methodists the only one to get in? I mean, how do we figure this? What about Baptists? Who gets in? How do we figure this out? Jordan, are you really telling me that there's this place and God's going to sort all of this out? Well, let me give you really the most compelling reason. Even if you have a trouble believing even in the first creation and all that. The most compelling reason you and I should believe in heaven is because Jesus believed in heaven. Jesus did. And whenever you predict your death and resurrection and you actually pull it off, you should be trusted, right? We should believe everything that Jesus said. Because Jesus is the Son of God, and we know he's the Son of God because he died on a cross. Not just that wasn't the amazing part. Many people died on crosses. Jesus was the only one who rose on the third day, and he lives forever and ever and ever. And really, as Christians, we're here not because of the Old Testament. We're not even here because of collections of historical documents that were put together inside the Bible. We're here today because Jesus still lives. Amen. We're here today because he is alive. And again, if Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection, we should believe everything that man says. So if you have a hard time believing in heaven, I want to introduce you to something that Jesus said about heaven and just use that to illustrate that if Jesus believed in heaven and he rose from the dead, he would know. He would know. In John chapter 14, Jesus has kind of prepared his disciples for the time where he's going to go into crucifixion and all of these things, and he's going to leave them. And obviously the disciples that are around Jesus, they realize that this is like a difficult thing, right? They're getting nervous, they're getting agitated. Because, Jesus is, he's about to go into crucifixion. And this is what Jesus says. He says, listen, don't let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. I want you to believe in me. I want you to trust in me. Just as you believe in God and everything that God has done in the world, I want you to see me as the representative, as the Son of God. When you have seen me, you have seen God. And if you believe in God, I want you to also believe in what I'm about to tell you. This is what he says. In my Father's house are many rooms. Now, perhaps you have heard this scripture talked about related to heaven. But if you read a King James Version, it says this, in my Father's house are many mansions. And the reason we get the word mansions is because of a translation that comes from Latin. right? And we get the word mansions. Now, here's the problem with that. I don't really have a problem with the word mansions as it relates to that, but the reason why the ESV and other translations translate that rooms or dwelling places is because that's really the idea that Jesus had in mind when he shared this whole thing. When we as Americans think of mansions, because we live in the wealthiest nation that in the history of the world, we think of rappers with like $1 million homes and songs. I've got a mansion on top of a hill. That's what we think of when we hear the word mansion. But the word actually, if you study it out in Scripture, the word mansion that was translated mansion from the Latin, it actually just means a dwelling place. And if you're still not convinced, I just want you to look at the wording of what Jesus said. In my Father's house. Inside my Father's house. So even if you use the word mansions, it really wouldn't make sense to imagine that there's this huge, gigantic house inside of another. That's not a mansion. If Jesus really meant of two separate places, he would have said, around my Father's house are many mansions. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, in my Father's house, singular, are many dwelling places, many rooms. Now, perhaps you have never heard this before, and I don't want you to get depressed. I don't want you to think, okay, oh man, then is heaven smaller than I imagined? Trust me, if you'll hang out with us for more of this series, I'm going to talk about the Father's house. I'm going to talk about the city that God has created for the people that love him. And let me just tell you, it's probably bigger than you have really ever imagined. The point of what Jesus is trying to say is, in the place where my Father is, in heaven, there are many places for everyone who wants to live there with him. There's enough room for everybody. Heaven will never have a no vacancy sign for those people who, through Christ, want to put their faith in him and want to move into heaven. So, before I get any other place today, you have an invitation that I'm giving you right now to go to heaven today. I mean, I know that you can't really go there until you pass away, but I want you to go ahead and accept your invitation and send back an RSVP right today, because heaven is not just for a certain select group of people. Heaven is for anybody who wants to come through Jesus and who wants to stay there. It's an amazing, huge, beautiful place that God has created for those that love him. But this is what Jesus said, in my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? Jesus says it this way, if this wasn't true, why would I even bring this up? So for those of us that would look at Jesus and say, Jesus, is heaven really for real? Are you telling me that there's a place where I can go to live eternally? And Jesus was saying, look, why would I even bring this up if it wasn't true? There's no reason why I would try to get your hopes up if this life was all there is. No. I'm telling you that this is true, and I know it's true, and I'm telling you I go to prepare a place for you. So Jesus is not saying I'm going to prepare a state of mind, right? So some people may think that heaven is just some state of mind. That's not what Jesus had in mind. In Jesus' mind, heaven is a place. It's a place just like your home, like my home, like this church, like Christiansburg, Radford, Reiner, Floyd, all of these areas, Pulaski. It is a literal place, and it's prepared by Jesus himself. It's prepared by Jesus himself. And this is what he said, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. So this is what Jesus' theology is about heaven. That he, as the Son of God, died on a cross and resurrected again, would leave his disciples, his followers, and go to prepare an eternal place for them, so that ultimately they would be together. And I just want to stop at this point and say, remember what we just looked at in the story of Genesis. That was the Garden of Eden. God and man and woman together in the most beautiful paradise that there's ever been. Heaven has always been on God's mind. The only reason that it hasn't worked out that way for so many people is because they've turned their back on God's plan to get us there. We can't get there without Jesus. So is heaven really for real? And Jordan, how do I know that heaven is really for real? Well, you can know that heaven is real because Jesus said so. Now I know if you're a parent in here, perhaps you've used this, right? What do you mean? Because I said so. Because I said so. And I understand that's pretty weak. Like, Mom, why can't I go to the party? Well, because I said so. Why can't I get this? Because I said so. Why can't I have cereal? Why can't I have chocolate chip cookies for breakfast? Because she said so. I understand that. Maybe you heard that. But listen, no one else is like Jesus. No one else died for the sins of the world and rose again from the grave. So when I say that Jesus believed in heaven and Jesus told it was real and Jesus said that he wouldn't even bring it up if it was false, we should believe Jesus. Heaven is a real place. And if you will stay with us as a church as we continue, every Sunday I'm going to try to answer questions about that particular place. But this morning, before I talk about really what heaven is like, I think it's important to tell you how to get there. Because another question, and if you've seen the video that was put on Facebook and things like this, another question is, well, Jordan, okay, heaven is a real place. Well, every time I go to a funeral, it seems like everybody's going there. Have you ever noticed that? I don't know if I've ever been to a funeral where somebody got up and said, you know what, this person lived a hard life. I don't think they made it. Like, nobody says that. And as a pastor, can I be honest with you and just say, as many funerals as I have done, even if I'm unsure, the last thing I want to do is hurt a family's feelings so even if they had a shirt on that said, I love Satan when they died, I'm just going to say they're in the Lord's hands, people. The last thing I want to do is hurt. But this question of does just everybody go to heaven? Is heaven just automatic? Doesn't just everybody who does, is just kind of a reasonable person? I know Hitler and dictators and stuff like that, and they probably don't make it. Criminals that have done heinous crimes, they probably don't make it. But come on, Jordan. Doesn't everybody who's just good enough, isn't good enough just good enough? Well, Jesus actually gives us the answer in the same passage. So he's talked about this place called heaven, but then he communicates this to his disciples. And this is what Jesus says. He says, look, I'm leaving you, but you know the way where I'm going. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And by the way, you know how to get there. You know how to get there. And then Thomas said to him, Lord, there's really no GPS. So what in the world? Can you give us the directions? You're going to prepare a place for us. Where is it going to be? Is your father's house? Is your father's house somewhere in Jerusalem? Somewhere in Israel? Is it even on this continent? Is it up, in the sky somewhere? Lord, how do we know where you're going? And how do we know the way? How do we know the way to the Father's house, to heaven, as we Christians believe it today? And this is what Jesus said. And this it's so interesting. Instead of giving GPS coordinates, instead of texting an address, this is what Jesus says. Jesus says, I am the way. I'm the way? You're the way? Jesus, what do you mean you're the way? We're going to a real place. How can you be the way? You don't look like a map. You look like a person. Jesus is saying, exactly. I am the way. I am the way to the Father's house. How do you get there? You follow me. You do what I say. You listen to me. You give your life to me. As long as you follow me, only me, I am the way. Well, but Jesus, I know you're the way, but what does that mean? He says, well, I'm the way, I'm the truth, and I am the life. Listen, you want to get to heaven, I'll tell you how to get there. You want to know the truth in life, I'll tell you the truth. You want to have a real good life. You want to live life to its fullest. Don't we all want to get the most out of our lives? while we're here on earth, Jesus says, I'll tell you how to get the most out of your life. I will give you life that is to the full, that's way more abundant, way bigger than you've ever imagined. I'm the way to the Father's house. I am the truth. I am the life. It's all found in me. And then Jesus says this, that perhaps you might have heard on some news organization, or perhaps you've heard some protests of Christians and you think to yourself, how could Christians be so close-minded? But actually, it's not something that Christian followers came up with. This is something Jesus actually said about himself. He said, I am the way, I am the truth, I'm the life, but no one comes to the Father except through me. Except through me. I know that it would be hard, it's kind of difficult to believe. It's hard to believe that all the religions in the world don't just somehow end up in heaven. Because, think about it. There are some religions that do teach ways of peace and things like that. I've never, gotten in a fight with a Buddhist. It's never, some world religions and some type of religion, they are kind of peaceful. Not all of them, but some of them are peaceful. And it's just like, well, don't we all just get there? And this idea that you have to go to heaven through Jesus and you can't believe anything else, that's just so close-minded. And perhaps you've heard that growing up. And the older perhaps you were, surrounded by people that were just like, you Christians are so arrogant. You think you're the only way to heaven. Listen, we don't think that because we came up with that. We think that because that's actually what Jesus said. We're not trying to push people out of heaven. We're just trying to show people the way to heaven. And Jesus said that no one, no Buddhist, no Hindu, no Muslim gets to the Father except through Jesus. No Christian gets to heaven without going through Jesus. So this is what I'm trying to tell you. Heaven is an actual place, but here's what you need to understand. It's an actual place, but it's not automatic. It's not default. See, if it were just default, then we really wouldn't have to worry what you believe. If heaven was just automatic and everybody went there when they died, I wouldn't even have to really preach and, get us out on a mission and having a relationship with Jesus Christ. But heaven is not automatic. The only way to get there is to go through Jesus. And if that sounds close-minded to you, then try to get on Interstate 81, head north, and pray that you're going to get to Florida. It won't happen. It won't happen. No matter how much you sing songs, you could be going down the road and 81 North singing songs and high-fiving everybody, and you're just never going to end up in Florida. There's many kind of ways that, you can go south, but really, south is the only way from here to get to Florida. And can I tell you this about heaven? Jesus, what he did on the cross and his resurrection, the only way to get to heaven. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be rude. But the reality is, without Jesus, we have no hope. What Jesus did on the cross, what he did in the resurrection, was he gave us an invitation to heaven. And that invitation is something that we receive and we put our trust in and we believe. That invitation is our way of acknowledging to God, and our response to that invitation is our way of acknowledging God, Jesus, you died for my sin. I could not be with you in heaven without Jesus. And so Jesus died for my sin. He forgave me. And now, accepting the forgiveness of my sin from Jesus, I have a pathway into heaven. I can experience this. But here's the thing. Heaven is real. It's authentic, but it is not automatic. You actually must respond to Jesus. Because he's the way, you need to follow him. Because he's the truth, you have to obey him. Because he is the life, you must give up your life to him if you want to get to heaven, because you will not get there without the salvation of Jesus Christ. You were invited this morning, but you must respond. And what do we typically call responses to an invitation? Well, it's this idea that heaven is real, but your RSVP is required. I did this, and I know Jennifer and Colin are about to get married, and the deal with the RSVP, you know, when you have a wedding and you have this event, like you're sending out invitations, but you do the RSVP thing because the caterers get all nervous when they don't know how many people they're going to have to feed when they get there, right? And here's the thing about heaven. A lot of people hear the invitation. They believe that heaven is real. They believe that because of what Jesus did, that somehow they can go, and they receive the invitation. But so many people don't respond to that invitation. They don't RSVP. They don't give their lives to God. They don't come to the altar and say, Lord, I'm yours forever. Here, take me. They just assume that because they've gotten the invitation, that they're going to make it in. And one of the stories that I read as I was studying for this is from a book called Heaven by Randy Acorn. And he details the story of a guy named, or a woman named Ruth Anna Metziger. She was, actually slated to sing at this really, prestigious wedding for a really wealthy couple. And as she sang at the wedding, and it was, I'm sure it was a beautiful wedding, they had this after party in this downtown place in Seattle. It was real, swanky. It was really, high class, all those kind of things. And then, like, even to the place where they would go, there was like this staircase, and then, there was like a ribbon that was cut, and the bride and groom walked up to the top of the staircase, and then there was the reception for the wedding. Well, Ruth, she had sang at the wedding. She had been a part of that. And so she walked up to the person that was there with the book and had the names of the people that were included in the reception. And she asked, if her and her husband were there. And the person keeping the book said, I'm sorry, like your name's not on this book. We can't let you upstairs into the party. And she said, well, I know. But, Ruth Anna Metziger, like that, it's there. And he said, I'm sorry. And then she got a little agitated. And she's like, listen, I sang at this wedding. I sang at the wedding. And this is what the guy said. It just kind of paraphrased. He said, I don't care what you did at the wedding. Your name's not in this book. I can't let you upstairs. And then her and the person she was with had to leave the area. They had to go downstairs, and they just walked away. And this is what Ruth Anna recounts. She remembered that at some point in her, in the last recent times, like the last week or months, she received an invitation to the wedding, but she thought that because she was singing in the wedding, she wouldn't really need to RSVP. Obviously I'm singing at the wedding. They know I'm going to be there, so, I don't need to RSVP. But because she never RSVP'd, she didn't make it into the reception. See, heaven is real. But your response to what Jesus did on the cross, your RSVP, it's French for please respond, right? Your RSVP is required. Listen to what Jesus says as we begin closing. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Not everybody who wants to go to heaven will go to heaven. Not everybody who pleads with God when they have passed on from this life will get to go to heaven. But Jesus said this, not everybody, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. So, Jesus, are you telling me that all I got to do is just do a few right things and then I'll get in? Well, that's really not what Jesus said. In fact, he goes on. He says, on that day, many will say, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? So Jesus, you said that the only people who get in are those that do your will. Didn't we do a lot of good things? We didn't smoke, drink, or chew and hang out with women and men that did and do and all that. We lived a good life. But this is what really Jesus' point is. Jesus says that he would declare unto them, I never knew you. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that Jesus just has amnesia and he can't recognize us? He don't know our name? That doesn't mean what Jesus means. No, Jesus knows everything about us. He's always known everything about us. What he means is that we didn't have a relationship. See, I know of President Trump, but I've never met him. You see what I'm saying? We don't have a personal relationship. Like, we've never talked. over the phone. I've never visited the White House and had a chat with him. Like, I know of him, but like, if we were together and somebody asked, hey, do you know who that Jordan fella is? He would not know at all who I am, right? And that's what Jesus is trying to say. Jesus is saying, look, I know you and you know me, but we don't have a relationship. And because we don't have a relationship, I never really knew you as someone who RSVP'd and who was determined to follow me. And he says, depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. You say, no, Jesus, I'm not a bad person. I did what I'm supposed to do. I went to church. Jesus, I taught a Sunday school class. I helped out with children's church. Jordan, I sang in the choir. Hello, I sang in the choir. Just like Ruth Anna, I sang at the wedding. And Jesus would say, your name's not written down. You never RSVP'd. You never chose to follow me. Heaven is authentic, but it's not automatic. Heaven is real, but your RSVP is required. Now, for the next few weeks, like I said, we're going to dive into really what heaven is like and what God intends for heaven. And I just encourage you to come back for that because it's awesome. It's awesome. But you know what? I don't really want to give you a preview of the wedding reception if you can't even make it through the door. I don't want to do that. That's just mean, right? So I don't want to do that. This morning, what I want to do is I want to make sure that everyone has RSVP'd to the invitation that God has given us through Christ to get to heaven. What I want to ask you is, have you given Jesus your RSVP? And I'm not just talking about, you raise your hand. No, have you given Jesus your life? Because that's really what your RSVP is. See, you've got to follow him as the way, the truth, and the life. That's how you respond. And if you're not ready, if you haven't sent that back, I don't want you to pass from this life and stand before Christ and say, Lord, look what I've done. And have him say, depart from me. I never knew you. That has to be the worst words ever spoken from Jesus' mouth. But it doesn't have to be that way. So let's stand this morning. Go ahead and bow your head.